So this is a wonderful setting, and I appreciate so much being invited by the Jung Society here. Um, it's it's such a pleasure for me always to be speaking to people who love Jung because it's not just Jung himself, but what he represents that is so missing in this world. And I think when I have written so many books about soul, I'm trying to carry on what he did. And someone suggested that tonight I talk to you, feels like night, it's this afternoon, isn't it? Uh, that I talk about my friendship with James Hillman, so I'm going to include some of that. But before I get talking about it, I'll just let you know what I have in mind about how we'll go or how we have felt in talking about it. So I'll talk to you for a while. And then I like to have a conversation with you. We'll get some lights then, I think, and then we'll take a break and then do a second part the same way. So the first thing I wanted to tell you, I have this memory of Hillman. I'd like to start with him. If you look on YouTube, you can find it. You can see him speaking at a conference in Washington, D.C. at the time that the Red Book appeared. And he tells a story. It's unusual for him to tell a story about his own life. He never did that. It wasn't, when you read his books, you don't get stories about his experience. When you read mine, you get way too much of my experience. I meet people and they know all about me and I know nothing about them. It's awkward. So, anyway, Jim, really, he signed all his letters to me, Jim, so I'm going to call him Jim, if you don't mind. Jim told me that, well, I'm going to tell you that later. On the YouTube piece, when he appears there, he tells this story that when he was a student in Zurich at the Jung Institute, long ago, obviously, he was there when Jung died. And he tells a story how he went into the room where Jung was laid out. And he brought a white flower with him. And he mentions in this commentary in Washington, he mentions there that the flower, as he looks back on it now, indicates to him how his relationship with Jung at that early time in his life was full of anima, that the flower was the anima, the flower itself. This white flower was an image for anima. I'll describe that a little later. Maybe not everybody here knows what I'm saying. And then he says something very interesting. He says, at that moment, I knew what I had to do in my life. He said he knew at that moment that he had to go and, I forget exactly how he put it, but something like he had to go and do his own work. His own work. And that's very interesting to me because in my friendship with him, which lasted 40 years, we were very close and did a lot of things together, just ordinary things together. In my friendship with him, if it was difficult, at times it was because he always went his own way. He's an interesting person. He was totally dedicated to Jung. Talking about Hillman now, totally dedicated to Jung. He wrote a book called Anima, in which on the left page are all quotes from Jung, and the right page are Hillman's ideas of what Jung said about anima. And I felt reading, when I first read that book, and many times I read it since, that this book represents exactly that moment when he was there with Jung's body. That he was dedicated and devoted to Jung on one side, and yet he knew he had to go his own way on the other side. And so in my friendship with him, that issue kept coming up. I remember that when we first got together and started just having fun together, doing things, up to that point, before he came, I was very involved with a Jung community in the city where we were living. And when they saw me having this friendship with Hillman, they disowned me. I mean, they told me, they met me once, they asked me to come for a meeting, and they told me I couldn't be part of their community anymore. I've never had anyone tell me that before. And it was because of my friendship with James, with Jim. So I don't have any bad feelings about that now. It's a long time ago, but I just want to say that because to describe him, that he was, I believe, so devoted. I know because I spent so much time with him, so devoted to Jung, dedicated, really his whole life dedicated to Jung, and yet at the same time had to go his own way. And he discovered that in the presence of Jung's body, with a white flower in his hand. So to people who are working with Jung, I would say that it's two-sided. There's a shadow to Jung. The bright side is that I don't think there's been anyone in the past 500 years who has, I mean, if I think anyone before that, I'm thinking people like Meister Eckhart, maybe he might have been close, but nobody that I know of that has perceived the dimension, the deep dimension of what it is to be a human being as Jung. Nobody. And that's wonderful because we can study him now and we can learn so much and become much better people, much deeper people, more beautiful people. I think that's the thing to say because of it. But there's a shadow side, and the shadow side is that whenever you meet anyone who is so powerful and has such incredible imagination and depth, it's easy to get sucked into that like a whirlpool. They get pulled right down into it and not have that experience that Hillman had of discovering in the presence of Jung that he had to go his own way with this work. So I think that's something and you know, anyway, Jung did that, didn't he? He was so dedicated to Freud, and he had such a close friendship with Freud. You know, they talk about the two of them meeting for the first time and having a conversation that lasted hours and hours. And then they wrote letters and they traveled together. But in the end, Jung had to be faithful to his vision and go his own way. So he did that. He is a model for that kind of thing. This is not the most important thing I want to say tonight. I just wanted to indicate that I think that is something to think about, especially for people who do get captivated by Jung. You have to, or anybody for that matter, you've got to be a little bit careful of it. Now, I wrote Care of the Soul published it in 1992. And I remember when I was presenting it to publishers, I told them that when they asked me what my plan was for the book, I said, I hope that it's the same kind of book as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that it would spawn not an environmentalist movement, because she had already done that, but a soul movement. And of course that was, I thought, very grandiose to say that at the time, but they bought it. And so they published that book, and I think about that sometimes. The word soul is used all the time. Jung used it. Hillman wrote Suicide in the Soul early and used it all the time. I first heard the idea of soul when I was, a young kid in a Catholic family going to a Catholic church. I remember then, the priest told us that your soul was like a little piece of fabric, and every time you did something bad, it got dirtier. That was my first deep understanding of soul. But I think that in the meantime, in the past 25 years, in some ways, I think we have become more soulful as a people. let me say as Americans, let me speak for us as Americans now, although I do speak, to people in many, many other cultures about this and their differences. But I think that in our world, we have in some ways become more soulful. We are aware of things we weren't before. We're more aware of how fragile our world is, the planet is that we are part of. We don't live on it, we're not on it. We are part of it. It reminds me of, George Carlin's take on going on airplanes. He says they invite him to go onto the airplane. He says, no, I'm going to go in the airplane. I feel that way about the earth. We're not on the earth. We're really of the earth. We are the voice of the earth, or the presence of the earth. And we are beginning to realize that, I think, gradually. It's becoming common, for people to realize, even those who argue against the environmentalism. I think they're probably more reacting to the fervor and the religiousness in the environmental movement than they are to the actual idea of taking care of your planet home. But anyway, whether that's the case or not, I think we have made some advances in soul. And you see what I'm saying here, right away when I put it that way, you see that for me to talk about the soul, it's not about what's happening inside us alone. That's important, but it's also what's happening to the world that we live in. So people sometimes ask me in those early days when I was talking about the book, Care of the Soul, how do I care for my soul? I would say, make sure that the doors and windows of your house work well. I mean, like, that's caring for your soul. It is your home. And cook well. Take some cooking lessons, for God's sake. Friendship is, in the history of soul, literature about the soul, the one theme you see coming up more than almost any other is friendship. Take a look at the history of writing about the soul. Most of those writers are writing about friendship. So anything that you can do to promote friendship is caring for your soul. And that's why I say taking cooking lessons, because who wants to come visit you if you can't cook? So maybe that's indirect, but it's very real about caring for your soul. It's a tangible thing. It's not off in the ethers somewhere. If you can read about soul in old literature and in contemporary literature that makes it all sound so abstract and so metaphysical that you can hardly get a hold of it. That's not how I see it. It seems to me that caring for the soul is something very tangible and daily, ordinary life. And one of the deep things the soul needs, one of the deepest things that the soul needs, most essential things, and it's not always literal, is home, a sense of home, of being at home. The soul really needs to feel at home. That's the base of it. To know where to live. Another little digression here. I did my doctoral studies at Syracuse University in religion, and I wrote my dissertation on Renaissance magic, and primarily on a figure that few people know. At that time, certainly nobody knew about him. Not nobody, but very few people. Marsilio Ficino, who was an interesting guy who lived his dates are 1433 to 1499, so 15th century. Wonderful time for art. He lived then, and he says in his writings, he wrote about soul, was suggesting we have a soul-centered society. He said then that one of the first things you should do to care for your soul is find out where in the world you should live. Like what place, geographically, where should you be? I know there's no question about that among people in Seattle. You're like people in Minneapolis. You're just too proud of your place, Visitors come and can hardly stand it, But at any rate, some of us who are not so fortunate do wonder about where we should live. And And that, according to Ficino, who understood soul very deeply, was the most important question to start with. Where should you be? And he suggested that to find out, his suggestion was to consult your astrology. That was his idea. That was typical at the time. Everyone thought astrologically in those days, the 15th century. It's only in the last 300 or 400 years that we have dropped in astrological consciousness, I think to our peril. I think it would be great if we all became astrologers again. At least in a general sense, where we were aware of what's happening in the sky. And Ficino would say, if you can look at the sky and look at what the sky was like the day you were born, you'd get a hint as to where you should be, where you should live. So it's a magical way of finding your way, not rational. I mean, if you sit down and start writing the do's and don'ts and the advantages and disadvantages of various places, that's quite a rational way of looking at it. But he suggested something more magical. Find out where the stars were. Find out what planets were, what they might suggest, or how they might hint at where to go. Now this is something important, I think, because the soul is different from the mind. And when we're living from the mind, we are using our reason and trying to figure things out, even trying to figure ourselves out. But when you really live from the soul, you work more by magic and by art and poetics. The poetics, that's the language of soul. So astrology is appropriate. Now I understand if someone is a scientist or a child of this contemporary age where we think so literally about things and so mechanically about them, you'd probably say, be turned off by that and say, well, astrology, that doesn't, there's no basis for that. Well, there's only no basis for it if you have a small mind. If your mind is too narrow, if your imagination has been stilted, that's why you don't see how astrology is valuable and how it makes sense. That's why. It's not because itself has any limitations. It doesn't. And as I said, people for millennia have been living under a meaningful sky, and we don't. We are not smarter than they. I know that's what we think, but we aren't. And so when you begin thinking of soul, I'm trying to say something here. When you start caring for soul, you have to shift away from a soulless way of thinking. You cannot care for your soul and be fully part of a soulless society. Do you get that? That impedes you. You can't even imagine. You don't even know what soul is. I could talk to you till I'm, crawling on the floor here, and it won't do any good if you are committed to this soulless society. It doesn't work. You can't do it. Now, when I was a young person, a young man, I left my home when I was 13 to enter a Catholic seminary. That's a big story. I'm not going to bore you with that tonight, but it's a story of finding my way in life. I think it's a rather soulful thing. But anyway, when I was a young person trying to find my way, I went into this monastery. And one of the first lessons I was taught as a monk was what they called contemptus mundi. We spoke Latin, we love Latin. We talked in Latin all the time. And contemptus mundi means world, like mundane means world. Contemptus does not mean contempt, though. It's one of those words you find in languages sometimes. It sounds like very much like the English word, but it means something a little bit different. Contemptus means resistance. Now, when I say that, I'm actually quoting Thomas Merton, the great Catholic spiritual writer who writes about this, Contemptus Mundi. And he makes that point. So that's what I'm suggesting to you. A contemptus mundi, not a contempt for the world, but a resistance to the world, where you don't buy into everything that the world is trying to force you into. It's a soulless society in general. I'm not saying we don't have a lot of soulful people, we do. But generally, as a culture, we don't have soul. That's just the way it is. We believe we quantify everything. I know, I taught in a psychology department for a while. That's a story too, how I got there, but I won't tell you that one. A little bit of Hermes involved there. So anyway, I remember teaching the psychology department, and students would come in and I'd talk to them, and I'd say, why do you want to study psychology? And they said, I want to help people. And I said, what courses are you taking? They said, well, our first course required is statistics. And I said, that's going to take you pretty deep in understanding what you're doing with people. That's where we are. That's a sign of where we are as a society. We trust counting. We trust numbers, quantifications, statistics. We trust that. If you can give so many numbers to prove something, we trust it. We don't trust an idea that has been around for 3,000 years, presented by the greatest thinkers of our culture over all that time. We don't trust those. We don't trust the ideas given to us by the great poets, because they didn't use numbers. You see? That's what I'm saying. Have some contemptus mundi. Resist that world. Don't buy into it. Don't buy into it. And I tell you, the world that's trying to convince us to be materialist and literalist about everything does that very subtly, and could convince you that that's right. I feel so strongly about this. And then recently I was editing a book of mine. I sent it to an editor in New York. I sent a manuscript to this editor, and she wrote back and said, this is a very beautiful book that you put together, but I think what you should do is add more studies so you can prove what you're saying. Oh boy, I could have gone and burned the place down, I mean, she is touching a very tender spot in me there. And I think it has to do with the soul. That if you want a soulful life for yourself, you have to resist the soulless society. You have to resist it. You have to say, okay, I don't see any soul here. I'm not participating. I'm not going to do that. That's why, in some ways, I've suggested over the years that when you live a soulful life, you become eccentric. You do. You become eccentric. The soul leads you into very interesting places. It leads you into your own destiny, into the richness of your life, but it leads you away from the common herd, that is following another Pied Piper. So there are two things there. Resist it when you see it, but be aware that the temptation is subtle. The temptation is subtle. You can easily fall for it. That, oh yeah, why should I read a poet about love when I can read a scientist now that tells me what the brain does when I love? Because that's hard. That's hard science. I can trust that. That's the contemporary way of feeling and thinking. There's no soul there, folks. No soul. And we're not resisting it. It's getting worse and worse all the time. I listened to this recently. I was driving somewhere in my car, and I had public radio on, and they said that we're going to have a program now on the science of love. And I said, oh, God. And so I turned it off as fast as I could, contemptus mundi, in practice. And then I thought, well, maybe it's over, and I turned it back on, and the person who was speaking was finally ending her presentation by saying, and so, when you see these parts of the brain light up, you know you're in love. So I immediately got my copy of the Sonnets to Orpheus of Rilke to clear my brain. So this is one of the points then about soul, that we live in a time too where quantification, scientific explanations for things, that these are technology is very, very strong. I'm not, even though it sounds like it, I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things, but we cannot let them suck our souls out of our lives. That's what happens when you give too much to it. You can give something to that. You might even find a study or two in my books. I like to do that. I like to pepper a little of that. It's a form of imagination. That's how I see it. It works. But I don't want to say this is the main thing, or this is the only thing, or I don't want to allow it to chase the soul out of what we do. So that's a big question for people today, isn't it? How can I care for my soul? Is it all right to have an iPhone or a smartphone and use it all the time? Is it all right to be at my computer a few hours a day, or several hours a day, or 24 hours a day? Is it all right to be very technological and have a soul? Now, some people say no. Some people say we should get rid of those things. I remember when my kids were small, we put them in a Waldorf school in New Hampshire. And one day, one of the teachers came to me and said, "Would you give us a lecture to the parents against the use of television?" And I said, "I will not. I love television." I said, "You can use television. I've had wonderful moments of television in my life. I don't want to give up television. The last thing I'm going to do is give a talk against it. That's not the way to bring soul into technology. By moralizing against it, that's not going to do anything. But we can ensoul, we can do our watching soulfully. We can choose what we watch. We can be aware that lest we become swept away by it and lose our minds in it. Yes, that's possible. It's possible. Anything can do that, though. Religion does it quite well. And we don't get rid of religion. I don't want to get rid of television. That was in those days when television was the main thing. Today it's different. It's the phones and it's the other technology we use. It seems to me that they can be extremely soulful. And I wish we'd had more writing. I know I should do a little of it, but I wish we had more writing about how to use our phones more with soul, with more humanity, with more depth. I'm sure all of it can be done. I'm so delighted myself that I can write my books on a Mac. I mean, if anyone tries to take my Mac away from me, you're in trouble. I love it. And if I love it, I think the suggestion that there's some soulful connection that between us. So it's not being against technology, it's how we do it. How we relate to it, I also feel that my friendships have improved, have been cultivated further through email. I just love to sustain my friendships with email. I know some people don't like that, but I do. I love to have that instant connection with people and be able to still write in a letter form. It's fantastic. I do write letters, and another thing I do is I have a spiritual practice. Some of you may know I do a tweet every day. I have a practice. I've done it for 3 years now. It's my spiritual practice. People ask me, "How do you meditate? And do you still pray?" And I say, "Well, I tweet every day." I do. It's my practice. I'm totally serious about this. Totally. Every morning I get up. I missed this morning. It's the first time I've missed in months. But traveling, it's a little bit difficult. So I think every morning I kind of stop everything. I just gather my thoughts and think, what is going on that I think is important today for everybody? Not for me, for everybody. And I get a thought. And I could easily write 5 or 10 pages about it, but I've got 144 characters. So I try to digest, compress the thought into just a few words that will go into a tweet. Now people say, "Why don't you do that on Facebook?" Well, I like that. I like that little stuff. I like being forced into these sentences. So I write the tweet, and I read it, and I realize that it could be a lot better. So I revise and I revise. This tweet, I'm revising the tweet, for a half hour in the morning. And I finally get it in the shape that I like, and I publish it. And it's great. I've got about 1,000 of them now. I mean, I love this little form. It's even shorter than haiku. It's amazing. So there, to me, you may disagree with me. A lot of people do. Most people disagree with most things I say, but for me, this practice is real. It's a real practice. It's a soul practice. It's a spirit practice. It's something that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's there because of technology. So I would rather not just moralize and say technology is heartless and should be gotten rid of. I hear that all the time from many people. I'd rather use it in a way that is, has some depth to it. And if it's possible, if it looks like there's a piece of technology that you just can't find your way into without losing your soul, then by all means, have contempt for it. Deal with it, get rid of it. But otherwise, I think we can transform this. So let me give you a second point. I have a few points written down here. Let me give you my second point about caring for the soul today, where we are today. First one is technology. That's really different from when I first wrote Care of the Soul. Second one is I'm aware of the fact, probably as a therapist, as an analyst, I'm aware of the fact that there's not much psychological insight or psychological education, I guess, going on in our world. People are not very psychologically adept. You know what I mean? We don't have skills, psychological skills. We don't have the good language. We use the same words over and over again. I often suggest that when people are looking for a more soulful way of dealing with some of their emotional problems, that they watch their language. We have a lot of language that doesn't help us. For example, I would say today, great many people, when you ask how they're feeling, they will say they're depressed. That word has come to mean nothing. The word depressed, I would suggest not using it anymore. I would suggest finding another word or a group of words that tells what you're feeling, what's going on. So instead of saying I'm depressed, say, well, I feel like there's no purpose in my life anymore, and I'm not sure I want to go on with it. Well, I know now where you are. And when you said I'm depressed, I didn't know that. Now I know a lot more. All you had to do is add a few more words, and words that really say what you're going through. And it not only helps the person you're speaking to, if that's what you're doing, it helps you to know what you're experiencing, what you're going through. If you keep using depressed, then I don't think you know who you are, what you're doing, and you wonder why you feel vague about everything and you can't find a solution. It's because your language doesn't express what you're experiencing. It's shorthand. It's in the popular culture. Everyone talks about depression. And maybe there are moments when depression would be a good word, but not usually. It might mean that, well, I didn't get enough sleep last night. I felt that today. I'm bringing that up, I guess, because I had 5 hours of sleep last night. I felt pretty depressed I felt edgy for a little while today and wondering if I could do anything the rest of the day, whether I should just send somebody else here today because I didn't have sleep. Well, that's great to be able to say that, I think. I feel pretty edgy and I feel kind of not my normal self because I didn't sleep last night. Well, that's great. Say that again. That's very clear. Then I know what I'm going through and you know what you're going through. You know I'm not angry at you. You know that I'm not sad about anything. You know a lot because I've told you what it is I'm experiencing. But we don't do that. Or another version of this issue is that we say, we say, well, something like, I'm feeling lonely, but I know I shouldn't feel lonely, but I do. I probably won't feel lonely next week, and I hope you don't feel bad about me because I'm lonely. All these qualifications. Probably the thing to do is say, I'm lonely. Period. It's the qualification. Do you notice that when people speak? You take away what you've said. You qualify it, and that's a way of toning it down until there's almost nothing left of what you've said. And then, therefore, you don't feel what you've said, and you don't know where you are, and ultimately you don't know who you are, and it's all over. You know, your soul is not there. So I would suggest a very simple way. I think that under this general heading that we're not so psychologically savvy today, part of it is that we don't speak very well psychologically, even in our ordinary language. We don't speak too well of it. Another possibility too, and this is where I think Jung offers us so much, as nobody else does, is that caring for your soul is understanding that you are in a soul process your entire life. That there is a process going on in you, like an alchemical process. I mean, Jung's discovery, if that's the right word, of alchemy was one of the most important things he ever did in his career. To discover that here is a practice that was going on rather unconsciously for a long time, just this ritual, and its metaphors and its images speak so accurately and so well and helpfully of what goes on in our process, because alchemy is a process. So I would suggest reading those 3 volumes of Jung's collected works that are his alchemical essays. If you haven't read them, get them, especially Mysterium Conjunctionis. What a wonderful book about the process that all of us go through. We are always in process as a person. It's not all interior either. It's somewhat interior, but it's not all interior. Because some of that process, we do it in our work. I think it's interesting that the Latin word opus means work, like the job you have could be your opus. But opus is also the word the alchemist uses for the process of deepening, becoming a person, becoming somebody, that process. So to know that you are in process and that everything that happens is meaningful to your process. It's not just your process. It's not all focused on yourself, but the world you're in as well, and your contribution to the world has to do with your process. But you are raw. This is what the alchemist says. You have prima materia. Believe me, you do, and I do. That means raw material. That means we have emotions, and we have fears, and we have wishes and longings that are raw. They have not been processed. They're not developed. They're not woven into all of our values. They're not enculturated. They're not brought into in line with our intelligence. They're raw. They just come out. Do you know what that's like? Did you ever just feel like you're just angry? You're just angry. People bump into you and, you say something. You feel like attacking. Well, that's raw. That's pretty raw. If your anger were not raw, it would be some force you have, some creative force you have in your life. That's how it would look. It wouldn't look like jabbing at somebody or expressing your anger physically at someone. It would, if that's raw. If it's refined, in the alchemical sense of refined, processed, then it is woven into your values and your thoughts, and you become a person where anger has been converted into this power that you've got in the world and in life, and it's a creative power. Hillman always said, always said it so many times, he said that he wrote his books out of his anger. His anger, he processed that anger all his life, to the very end. I sat with him on his deathbed. And we spent hours, and he'd wake up from the morphine sometimes, and we'd have a conversation, very lucid conversation, and then he'd drift off. And he would say, he'd say, kind of drifting, he'd say, did you know, did I ever tell you anger really was my companion and my aid for all my career? Did I ever hear that? I heard it about 1,000 times. But that is an example of how we have this raw material, chemical idea, we can make something of it and be creative out of it. Okay, that's a lot. I get going and hours go by. So if you have anything to say about any of these topics, I'll just remind you, I was talking about how care of the soul has changed a bit. Even though I think we've become a little bit more soulful, but we've also moved the other direction, especially with our insanity regarding technology, and literalism is still there. And secondly, that we could be more psychological savvy, and we're not, probably because we don't teach how to be psychologically astute. We don't teach it because we don't have teachers probably that can do it, but we need that. We need that.